My favorite thing about Collin was always that he helped me so much and was my helper boy.
My mother's told my siblings one truth. Her keeping me away from them, also taking me out of school, was her way of...
Imagine a family of 10 smiling through your TV screen, soundtracked by an upbeat, generic 2000s acoustic guitar. You thought you were watching the ultimate chaotic, wholesome American dream, right? Fast forward to today, and a single book cover shatters that nostalgia into a million pieces. It's a photo of a mother forcefully covering her young son's mouth. Collin Gosselin is finally speaking, and the secrets he's spilling make the reality TV cameras look like a front for a literal nightmare. But just how dark did things get when the cameras stopped rolling? The locked room in the basement. People have to look at what happened the second the TLC production crew packed up their gear and drove away to understand how a chubby-cheeked kid from Pennsylvania ended up writing a harrowing tell-all memoir. For years, viewers watched Kate Gosselin march around her pristine house, managing her hyper-organized, color-coded schedules, barking orders at her husband, and keeping 8 toddlers perfectly in line. It was stressful, sure, but it was packaged as the relatable chaos of modern parenting. But according to Collin, behind the closed doors of that massive Wernersville estate, the discipline wasn't just strict, it was allegedly psychological warfare, and he was the primary target. Collin's first major revelation completely tears down the myth of the quirky, type A reality mom. He alleges that he was systematically isolated from his brothers and sisters, effectively turned into the family scapegoat. While the other kids played, Collin claims he was frequently banished to the basement. But it wasn't just a standard timeout. The upcoming memoir details horrifying instances where he alleges his hands and feet were bound with zip ties, leaving him trapped alone in a dark, concrete room for hours on end. Try to sit with that image for a second. While America was falling in love with these kids on television, buying their merchandise, and tuning in by the millions, one of those very children was allegedly being treated like a prisoner in his own home. Why him? That is the question that has haunted fans since these allegations leaked. In a toxic family dynamic, the scapegoat is often the child who naturally questions authority, reacts to the stress around them, or simply refuses to play along with the scripted perfection. Collin admits he was a spirited kid, but in Kate's hyper-controlled world, any deviation from the script was treated as a threat to the family brand. Collin alleges that his mother took out her deep-seated anger, marital frustrations, and the immense pressure of fame directly on him. He wasn't just disciplined, he was seemingly erased from the family unit while still living under the same roof, forced to eat meals separately, and banned from standard sibling interactions. The psychological toll of this kind of targeted isolation on a developing child is almost unimaginable. Imagine being 10 years old, watching your brothers and sisters laugh and play upstairs through a basement floorboard, knowing a camera crew is celebrating your family's bliss to the world, while you are locked in the dark. Collin's account suggests that Kate didn't just want to punish him. She wanted to break his spirit so he wouldn't disrupt the highly lucrative reality TV empire she had built. It was a flawless facade on the screen, but underneath the floorboards, a dark dependency on control was spiraling out of hand. So, how do you make a child like that completely disappear without raising suspicion from the network or the fans? The 2016 disappearance, the truth behind the special needs institution. In 2016, eagle-eyed fans of the show noticed something jarring. The Gosselin family portraits felt empty. On social media and in magazine spreads, one face was suddenly missing from the lineup of 8. Collin was gone. When pressed by a confused and increasingly suspicious public, Kate Gosselin offered a calm, clinical explanation. Collin had special needs and required intensive, full-time behavioral therapy. She painted herself as a heartbroken but brave mother, making the ultimate sacrifice for the welfare of her child and the safety of her home. But according to Collin, the truth of his sudden disappearance wasn't a medical necessity. It was a calculated, state-sanctioned exile designed to silence him permanently. At just 12 years old, Collin was packed up and dropped off at a behavioral health institution. For a child who had already spent years being isolated in his own basement, this was the ultimate abandonment. He wasn't sent to a cozy, supportive, therapeutic boarding school. He was placed into a rigid, locked facility. Collin alleges that the reality inside those walls was a living hell. He claims he was heavily medicated against his will, stripped of his autonomy, and subjected to physical restraints. In his interviews, he described a terrifying environment where staff members would routinely hold him down on the floor if he showed any signs of distress or frustration. The narrative Kate had fed to the media was that Collin was inherently dangerous and unpredictable. But looking back through the lens of his upcoming memoir, it looks far more like a mother using an institutional loophole to remove a whistleblower from her house. He wasn't sick. He was just a kid who knew too much and refused to stay quiet. For nearly 3 long years, Collin was trapped inside the system, almost completely cut off from the outside world. Kate rarely visited, and his siblings were allegedly told that Collin was where he belonged because of his issues. He was a forgotten child, buried under a mountain of medical paperwork and public relations spin. But Collin's spirit didn't completely break. In 2018, realizing that no one from his mother's camp was ever coming to get him, a 14-year-old Collin managed to smuggle a desperate, handwritten letter out of the facility. It wasn't addressed to Kate. It was addressed to his estranged father, Collin Gosselin, who had been locked out of his children's lives for years by a brutal custody agreement. The letter was a literal cry for survival. In jagged, teenage handwriting, Collin begged his father to save him, stating clearly that he was being abused, heavily medicated, and that he could not survive the facility much longer. He wrote that John was his only hope. That single letter changed everything. Armed with proof of his son's desperate situation, Collin Gosselin launched an emergency legal battle. In December 2018, a judge granted John Soule legal and physical custody of Collin after Kate and her legal team failed to even show up to the court hearing. When the facility doors finally opened, Collin didn't go home to the mother who claimed to love him. He walked into the arms of the father who had to fight the legal system just to prove his son wasn't a monster. The public was told Collin was being cured. In reality, he was just being hidden away so the cameras could keep rolling without a hitch. But escaping the institution was only half the battle, because the emotional damage left behind required a whole new kind of rebellion. The ultimate insult. Happy birthday to my real mom. When Collin finally walked free from that institution, the physical shackles were gone, but the emotional war was far from over. He was a teenager trying to piece together a normal life while carrying the psychological weight of a childhood spent under a microscope and behind locked doors. Collin Gosselin provided a safe harbor, but a teenage boy navigating that level of trauma needs more than just a roof over his head. He needs unconditional, nurturing maternal love. And since Kate had completely washed her hands of him the moment he went to live with his dad, Collin had to find that bond somewhere else. Enter Colleen Conrad, John's longtime girlfriend at the time. Colleen didn't sign up for the reality TV fame, and she certainly didn't expect to become the emotional lifeline for a deeply traumatized child. Yet, when Collin arrived at his dad's house, bruised by the system and isolated from his siblings, Colleen stepped into the vacuum left by Kate. She didn't treat him like a PR problem or a special needs liability. She treated him like a son. The depth of that relationship exploded into the public eye when Collin took to Instagram to post a birthday tribute to Colleen. It wasn't just a sweet message, it was a tactical, nuclear strike directed straight at Kate Gosselin. Collin publicly declared Colleen as his real mom, thanking her for stepping up, loving him unconditionally, and teaching him what a true mother actually looks like. The internet absolutely melted down. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a petty teenage swipe, but to fans who had watched this family for over a decade, it was a profound, heartbreaking revelation. For a child raised on television to explicitly strip his biological mother of her title on a public platform is the ultimate rejection. It proved that the maternal instinct Kate so fiercely marketed to the world on TLC was, in Collin's eyes, an absolute fraud. He wasn't just praising Colleen, He was telling the world that the woman who gave birth to him had completely forfeited the right to be called his mother. Predictably, this public declaration ignited a fresh wave of toxicity within the fractured family dynamic. While fans cheered Collin's bravery and applauded Collin for healing a broken child, Kate's camp viewed it as an unforgivable act of betrayal, an orchestrated smear campaign engineered by John. The post drew a hard line in the sand. It signaled to the world that Collin was no longer just a victim waiting for an apology. He was an adult taking control of his own narrative, redefining family on his own terms, and leaving Kate completely behind in the rearview mirror. He was proving that blood doesn't make you a mother, actions do. But to truly understand how a mother could spark this level of public defiance from her own flesh and blood, we have to go back to where it all began. Rewinding the tape, the toxic dynamics of John and Kate, +8. To truly understand how this family completely self-destructed, you have to rewind the tape back to 2007. It was the golden age of reality TV, a time when networks like TLC were pivoting away from educational content and leaning heavily into human interest spectacles.
Kate Gosselin and the 8 children will star in TLC's one-hour Kate +8 special. Kate tells Us Weekly that her kids were extremely excited to film again.
Enter the Gosselins, a relatable mid-20s couple from Pennsylvania, blessed or cursed with a set of toddler twins and a brand new set of sextuplets. To the average viewer collapsing onto the couch after a long workday, the show was addictive. It was the ultimate logistical circus. We watched Kate frantically navigate grocery store aisles with an army of matching strollers, organize mountains of laundry, and orchestrate military-style family vacations. It was fast-paced, it was stressful, but it was packaged as wholesome, aspirational family entertainment. But if you re-watch those classic episodes today with fresh eyes, the nostalgia instantly curdles into something deeply uncomfortable. What we collectively laughed off as Type A parenting or bickering looks a lot more like a televised dictatorship in hindsight. Kate wasn't just organized, she was a hyper-controlling force of nature who ran her household with an iron fist. Her perfectionism wasn't just a quirky trait for the cameras, it was the law of the land. If John bought the wrong brand of organic juice, he was berated on camera. If the toddlers didn't sit perfectly still for a promotional photo shoot, the tension in the room became palpable. The kids weren't just growing up, they were performing under a relentless spotlight, and their mother was the director. As the ratings soared, reaching a staggering 9.8 million viewers during its peak, the financial stakes skyrocketed. The Gosselins were no longer just a large family trying to survive, they were a multi-million-dollar corporation. And in any corporation, productivity is king. The children's milestones, their potty training, their tantrums, their loose teeth, and their tears became monetizable content. This is where the family dynamic twisted into something toxic. When your everyday life dictates the size of your network paycheck, there is no room for off days. The kids had to be cute, they had to be cooperative, and they had to fit into the narrative of the perfect, chaotic, yet blessed American family. But children aren't props, and they don't develop at the same pace. This is exactly where the cracks began to form, and where Collin's nightmare truly started. While some of his siblings managed to adapt to the constant presence of camera crews and production lights in their living room, Collin naturally pushed back. He was an expressive, highly sensitive child who reacted to the chaotic environment around him. In a normal household, a child acting out under immense stress receives extra attention, therapy, or a break from the noise. But in the Gosselin house, a child acting out was a direct threat to the production schedule. If a scene was ruined, money was lost. Collin's refusal to perfectly perform his role in the scripted chaos meant he was increasingly viewed not as a son needing support, but as a liability to the brand. The cameras captured the subtle shift long before the public realized what was happening. Rewatching old clips, you can see Collin frequently isolated on the edges of the frame, receiving sharper reprimands than his siblings, or looking visibly exhausted by the artificial reality forced upon him. The show created an ecosystem where compliance was rewarded with affection, and resistance was met with swift, cold banishment. John was increasingly beaten down, losing his voice in the household completely. leaving Kate with absolute authority over the children and the contract. The family home had effectively been converted into a high-pressure studio lot, and the boss was completely uncompromising. But a house built on a foundation of forced perfection and exploited childhoods can only stand for so long before the walls start caving in. The War of the Parents, John versus Kate. But who was supposed to protect these kids when the domestic paradise officially fell apart? In 2009, the flawless facade didn't just crack, it completely shattered in front of nearly 10 million horrified viewers. The announcement of John and Kate's divorce wasn't just a quiet family tragedy, it was a highly publicized multi-million-dollar media circus. For months, supermarket tabloids had been tracking John's alleged infidelities and late-night partying, while Kate positioned herself as the betrayed, long-suffering matriarch.
That we will separate.
It's just not good for our kids.
With divorce proceedings underway, 34-year-old Kate began announcing her feelings about their split.
When the split finally became official, it triggered a toxic, decade-long legal war where the courtroom became the new stage, and the 8 children were used as the ultimate collateral damage. The immediate fallout of the divorce laid the groundwork for the structural collapse of the family. The court originally awarded Kate full legal custody of all 8 children, while John was left with basic visitation rights and a staggering child support order of $22,000 a month. For a guy who was suddenly cut out of the TLC payroll, that financial burden was a death sentence. John went from a reality TV star to a guy jumping between odd jobs, struggling to pay bills, and eventually working as a DJ just to keep his head above water. But the financial destruction was nothing compared to the emotional warfare. John would later reveal that he spent over $1.3 million navigating 9 different attorneys over 12 agonizing years, constantly dragged back to court by Kate over every minor scheduling dispute. This wasn't a standard custody disagreement, it was a calculated campaign of total erasure. John alleged that Kate engaged in severe parental alienation, systematically poisoning the children's minds against him. The psychological strategy was simple. If you control the kids, you control the narrative, and if you control the narrative, you keep the TV contracts alive. By the time the older twins, Maddie and Kara, reached their early teens, they simply stopped showing up to John's house for scheduled visits, publicly stating they wanted nothing to do with him. The family home had become an echo chamber of resentment. If John tried to enforce his visitation, police were called to handle verbal domestic arguments in public parking lots, transforming everyday milestones like a routine trip to the children's orthodontist into screaming matches covered by TMZ. The kids were caught in a brutal crossfire. On one side stood a mother backed by network lawyers and public relations teams, desperate to spin the show into Kate plus 8 to keep the cash flowing. On the other side stood a father who felt entirely powerless, legally gagged by strict non-disclosure agreements that prevented him from defending himself or his kids in public. John majorly backtracked on his initial compliance, claiming he spent years trying to get his kids off television entirely. But the legal machinery of reality TV was too massive to stop. Every time John tried to gain a foothold, the system pushed him back. In this multi-million-dollar corporate war, the children weren't viewed as developing human beings who needed a stable environment to process their parents' traumatic divorce. They were treated as assets to be divided, voices to be managed, and paychecks to be secured. Kate's complete control over the legal and physical environment of the household meant that John was slowly, systematically erased from the lives of 6 of his 8 children. He was isolated, broke, and vilified by the media as the deadbeat dad who walked away from his family for a taste of fame. It was a flawless victory for Kate's brand, but it left a path of total destruction in its wake. And yet, the absolute worst consequence of this parental warfare wasn't just the distance between a father and his children. It was the toxic venom that began to spread horizontally among the siblings themselves. Fractured siblings, a house divided permanently. When we think about childhood trauma, we usually focus on the vertical damage, the scars inflicted by a parent onto a child. But in the case of the Gosselin family, the most devastating tragedy might actually be horizontal. The absolute destruction didn't just happen between John and Kate, or even just between Kate and Collin. It completely severed the bonds between the children themselves, effectively splitting a set of biological sextuplets down the middle. Today, the kids are all adults in their 20s, but instead of being a tightly knit unit forged in the fires of unique reality TV fame, they are a house divided permanently. Collin has heartbreakingly admitted that he and 6 of his siblings might as well be total strangers. Think about that for a second. You share the exact same DNA, you shared the exact same womb, and you spent the first decade of your life in matching outfits in front of millions of viewers, and today, you don't even have each other's phone numbers. Collin has taken to social media, specifically TikTok, to share his grief, posting raw messages about how they were forced apart and pitted against each other for the sake of fame and money. He has openly wept behind closed doors over the memories they never got to make, declaring that he still loves them to death, even though they treat him like a ghost. So why the total freeze-out? The answer lies in the deeply toxic phenomenon of parental alienation and family loyalty tests. When Collin was institutionalized in 2016, a narrative was firmly established in the main Gosselin household. The remaining siblings, Maddie, Kara, Alexis, Aiden, Joel, and Leah, grew up under Kate's absolute influence. To them, Collin wasn't a victim. He was the troubled, volatile sibling who disrupted their mother's hard work and threatened their stability. When Collin and his sister Hannah ultimately chose to live with John, a line was drawn in the sand. In a highly fractured family dynamic, neutrality is viewed as treason. Choosing to stand by Collin or John meant turning your back on Kate, and for the other 6 children, that was a price they weren't willing to pay. The depth of this estrangement became painfully obvious when the older twins, Maddie and Kara, broke their silence to completely back their mother. Maddie went on social media to fiercely defend Kate, stating that she would never tolerate or excuse the behavior of someone who allegedly made their lives unsafe. She made it clear that she has zero interest in a public reconciliation. For Collin, this is a double abandonment. First, he was discarded by his mother, and now he is actively locked out by the very brothers and sisters he longs to connect with. Even his relationship with Hannah, the one sister who originally moved out with him to live with John, has faced immense pressure as she tries to balance a relationship with both parents, while Collin remains strictly excommunicated. It is a sobering reminder that reality television doesn't just steal a child's privacy. It can structurally ruin their ability to form a family support system. While Collin uses his public platforms like a digital message in a bottle, hoping his siblings will see who he truly is outside of the headlines, the silence from the other side remains deafening. The Gosselin kids were born to be a team, but the machinery of television transformed them into opposing factions, leaving Collin to navigate his adulthood entirely isolated from the peers who should understand his trauma better than anyone else alive. But Collin's upcoming memoir isn't just a personal grievance against his family. It is actually a massive warning shot to an entire industry that has operated without rules for decades. The reality TV child labor crisis. Collin Gosselin's explosive memoir, In the Shadow of 8, Surviving the Reality of My Childhood, is much more than a collection of salient family grievances. It is a damning indictment of an entire industry. For decades, reality television has operated in a legal Wild West, completely unbothered by the strict child labor laws that protect traditional Hollywood child actors. When a minor signs on to a scripted movie set, Coogan law protections require that a percentage of their earnings be locked away in a trust fund, while strict regulations limit their working hours and guarantee on-set education. But because reality TV is legally classified as unscripted or documentary content, networks like TLC found a massive loophole. The children aren't technically considered actors or employees. They are just living their lives in front of a camera. This legal gymnastics allowed networks and parents to bypass child labor laws entirely, transforming children into highly profitable laborers who have no legal claim to the millions of dollars they generate. Collin's upcoming book brings a terrifying new dimension to this conversation by detailing the psychological mechanics of what happens when a child's entire existence is commercialized. Promotional materials for the memoir tease harrowing details that go far beyond standard behind-the-scenes drama, including a chilling account of a Christmas morning where the children's holiday gifts were allegedly reclaimed the second the production cameras stopped rolling. This reveal exposes the core sickness of the industry. The child's joy, their wonder, and their very relationship with Santa Claus were treated as temporary production props, manufactured solely for a holiday special, and then stripped away once the monetization window closed. By sharing the truth about being physically held down, hidden away in a basement cell, and forced onto a cocktail of powerful antipsychotics at just 11 years old, Collin is providing a rare, unfiltered look at the extreme structural lengths to which a system will go to protect its cash cow when a minor refuses to comply with the scripted narrative. This is where the culture shift becomes undeniable. Collin's voice is joining a rapidly growing, historically unprecedented reckoning against the exploitation of unconsenting minors for public consumption. We are finally beginning to understand that whether it is a network camera crew from the 2000s or a modern mommy vlogger recording her children's private meltdowns for TikTok views in 2026, the psychological damage is exactly the same. When a child's developmental milestones, private traumas, and domestic punishments are turned into entertainment, their fundamental right to a safe, private upbringing is completely obliterated. High-profile advocates like Paris Hilton, who personally endorsed Collin's memoir by praising his bravery in turning institutional trauma into purpose, are helping elevate his story from tabloid gossip into a serious legislative conversation. Collin is transforming from a tragic reality TV footnote into a powerful advocate, using his lived horror to demand legal protections for a new generation of kids who are currently being used as content before they are even old enough to speak. But as the world prepares for the shockwaves of his full story, what has actually happened to the rest of the players in this decades-long drama? The final roll call. So, where does that leave the cast of America's most tragic family circus today? Nearly 2 decades after the initial TLC cameras flickered to life, the coordinates of the Gosselin family are scattered, permanently divided by an invisible line of trauma and loyalty. At the center of it all is Kate Gosselin, who has almost entirely retreated from the Hollywood spotlight she once fought so viciously to maintain. After relocating to Troutman, North Carolina, she quietly went back to her roots, obtaining a multi-state registered nurse license to work far away from the television cameras. John Gosselin, meanwhile, has found a completely different path. He still works as a DJ and IT analyst, recently marrying his partner Stephanie Lebo in 2025.
John Gosselin is a married man once again. The John and Kate Plus 8 alum and Stephanie Lebo tie the knot in front of their friends and family in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, November 23rd.
Attempting to cultivate a normal life out of the wreckage of his 30s. As for the kids, they are now full-fledged adults navigating their 20s, and their paths could not be more distinct. The older twins, Maddie and Kara, have chosen paths of privacy. Kara graduated from Fordham University, while Maddie went to Syracuse, both keeping their lives guarded from the public eye while remaining staunchly defensive of their mother. Among the sextuplets, the divide is a literal physical and emotional map. Alexis, Aiden, Leah, and Joel moved to North Carolina with Kate, remaining tightly bonded to her and entirely estranged from their father. On the other side of the fracture stand Hannah and Collin. Hannah remains the unique, fragile bridge of the family, living primarily with John, but trying to maintain a private relationship with both parents and all 7 siblings. And then there is Collin. After briefly enlisting in the U.S. Marine Corps, he has pivoted to the ultimate act of reclaiming his autonomy. With the impending release of his memoir, In the Shadow of 8, he is no longer just the silent boy on the cutting room floor or the hidden child in a locked facility. He is a survivor standing on the wreckage of his past, finally ready to have the last word. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss our next deep dive into the internet's biggest stories.